Well, one of the key pillars of the foundation's work is the dialogue work that we do. We use the past that Madiba traveled to then reimagine what kind of country he wanted and how we should build it.
South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
The Nelson Mandela Foundation enjoys a particular legitimacy. Just because we're riding on a name that has established itself of a person who was fair. Madiba understood dialogue. He said, when you have two people in the room who like being with one another, who enjoy each other's company, that's not dialogue, it's a chat. Real dialogue is when you bring people in the room who do not want to even greet each other. And that's the kind of dialogue that we host here. The Nelson Mandela Foundation is a listening institution. We convene dialogues to create a safe space for people to be able to look into some of the things that disturb the peace. Some of the work that we do on dialogue, particularly on land, which has become an issue that has divided our nation. Those who are actually removed are forgotten, they are discarded, and they continue to feel the pain of loss from the land. Connecting them to those who are policymakers, to understand what are the issues. We have hosted dialogue, for example, on reckoning with the past. Remember that the Truth Commission did a lot of work with Archbishop Tutu and Madiba as the two who are leading figures on that. And we're trying to then say there was unfinished business there. How do you then ensure that those who continue to feel the pain of loss of their loved ones are then recognized and that pain is dealt with? Part of this kind of work of our dialogues has been on building a more socially acceptable capitalism that helps build a nation. One element of that kind of capitalism in terms of its toxicity is mining, that has poisoned people, extracted what needed to be extracted, and left communities ravaged, from families that were broken to how communities just have to then be glued together again. And those who mined are now gone, and they've got what they needed to take from the land. The second part of our work is our memory work. We're fortunate that Madiba bequeathed his private papers to us. The letters he wrote while he was in prison, notes he made during the negotiations, how he arrived at some of the key decisions that he made, and the dreams that he had for the country that he wanted to see. And that's part of the core, in fact, of the work, because we use that as the basis for every part of our work, from our publications, the dialogue work that we do, to the kind of country that we want to have, a reconciled nation. The third pillar of our work is Mandela Day. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to help build this into a brand that people understand that it's not about 67 minutes. It's not about action on a day, being Madiba's birthday on the 18th of July. It's about doing this every day, that you take action, inspire change in your community for the better, and make every day a Mandela Day. The thing that we're trying to achieve with the work that we do is to respond to Madiba's mandate, which was threefold: peace building, democracy, consolidate our democracy, and human rights. How do we, as an institution, reimagine ourselves in the next 20 years? This is our 20th anniversary. What will the next generation find us looking like in the next 20 years and the next 20? And it's that reimagination work that needs to be done every day.
It is time for new hands to lift the burdens. It is in your hands now.
The Nelson Mandela Children's Fund comes into being in the most extraordinary and unusual of ways, in that it's born in a man's heart. The Children's Fund approach is interesting in that people find it very difficult to account to children. Mr. Mandela actually started our first Children's Parliament in 1999, and he established that. And he established it to help us hear the voices of children, and annually to go back to the same platform and report to children what we have done. And the children have been able to hold us accountable.
We're here for the Nelson Mandela Children's Foundation Summit. It's about asking children about their ideas to change child rights or rights in general that would make the country a better place.
We need to create social change, we need to create social campaigns that advocate for children with inabilities.
What things can we do per se on trying to fix that, also on like a local as well as a national level?
I think though that there is a strong case for free sanitary towels to be made available, especially to girls.
My name is Dr. Makaimwe and I'm from a small village. Let me focus on the role of school elders.
How can we trust in you that you are going to lead a revolution, not necessarily a revolution, but lead us towards getting better equality, better diversity?
Also for the House launch to also know that the term used for any person with an inability is not that they are suffering from it if they have it.
I dream of a South African duty to educate and unemployment.
Human rights violation.
What if we make this change? What if the child studies all the things that different political parties want to change in the country, and they understand the depth of what they're doing, and they go through 1 or 2 assessments, and they have like the voting intelligence of an adult, but if the child has surprisingly high intelligence, but they are still not allowed that just because of their age. It's not because of what's on the outside, it's because of what's on the inside.
It's a values and approach is something that's very integral in how we do things. And of course, it comes from working with children and not for children. The Children's Fund, as a single organization, would have no impact at all. Our impact and our strength lies in the network of community-based organizations, tertiary institutions that we network with. It's been thousands now. My team and I spend a lot of time building institutions at community level, and that has got to do with organizations that work at the coalface. For us to be powerful, we need everyone in the system to be powerful.
Over the past 24 years, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund has made numerous successful interventions in HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention, creating support structures for children orphaned by the impact of the HIV epidemic. The fund also provides training for community health workers, magistrates and police to better handle child sexual abuse cases, thereby honouring Mr. Mandela's commitment to make South Africa a safe place for children.
We subject ourselves to research all the time, and our latest research pointed out that the area that needed most intervention was the first 1,000 days of life, because that's where our child mortality was unacceptably high. So we went into data about every province, every region, every rural area, so as to be able to understand where we would intervene. The missing piece are the social determinants of health, the things such as nutrition, Is the child fed? Is the food in the house? Is the money in the house? And so in running the program, First 1,000 Days of Life, we run alongside that sustainable livelihood. And sustainable livelihood deals with nutrition, your own vegetable gardens, and people saving the little money they have. And through that, be able to provide better lives for children. Our work is often to pilot new ideas, new ways of looking at the problem. It's been very important for the Children's Fund to continue to be engaged in policy so that we can input in policy and improve both policy and practice. The issue of sustainability has been an important part of the Children's Fund from its very inception. We were also very lucky that the first group of people that Mandela had put around him thought about putting aside money for the future. We've grown from that to a full endowment. We built to a point 3-4 years ago where we could contribute to the building of the Children's Hospital, which is now operational. Every time we're measured as management, we're also measured against how we're doing in sustainability and building an endowment. What sustainability helps us with? It helps us with the donors, that we're not asking the donor to give us all the money that is required for a program that we've dreamt up, but we're asking a donor to partner with us. The donor also brings other experiences. So together we invest in the programs that we do. So the endowment is very, very important in keeping together the vision, the mission of the organization.
I was born on the 10th of April 1993, the same day that Chris Hani was assassinated. Chris Hani was a political leader in the country, and at the time South Africa was facing civil war. And my mother was expecting to give birth to a black boy, and instead she gave birth to a white girl. My mom actually didn't want to take me because she thought the babies were swapped, so the doctor had to put me away and sit down with my mom and explain that I actually had a rare genetic disorder called albinism. In South Africa, and many parts of Africa, there are a lot of superstitions depending on the culture you come from. The common ones are, we are good luck. You are good luck if you're born. So if a family has a child with albinism, depending on where you are, you're a great charm. Depending on where you were born, you're also a very great curse. And you doom a whole village if you're in that village. So some communities will even drive you and kill you. If you hang a body part of a person with albinism, you start bringing in money into your house if you have a business from your home. The mysticism around albinism is so dehumanizing. It's life-threatening. It literally is. It's scary. I'm either a gift or a curse, but either way I die for being who I am.
Abongile was orphaned at the age of 13, just 2 months before she found out that she was accepted at the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa.
Holding Albus is my social venture. It was just supposed to raise awareness around albinism. My activism has taken a huge leap of growth and development. There were also other things that needed visuals, that people needed to see, and I wanted that to be easily accessible to all the masses. And I wanted to do this through a YouTube channel. Hi everyone, it's Abongile Kantini without a skin color. What albinism or with no pigment means.
Abongile searched on social media for other young women with albinism and found them.
Here we are, 3 women who are showing our activism and living our lives and freely moving towards our greater selves. The idea is that we move together and that in our activism, we leave no one behind, no one. Whether you are working on something else that's different, the idea is that we support you. It's going to be that member in the box pointing out all the differences. Or we're going to be the member in the box who brings other people in, however different they may be. When I found out that I was nominated by the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund to be one of the young Nelson Mandelas of my generation. I'm not even 27 years old, I'm 25 years old. And Mr. Nelson Mandela was in prison for longer than my lifetime. How can I possibly think I emulate such great legacy? It's humbling. And it is the humility that gives me that gives me hope.
We need more testosterone in this building. That is an ongoing joke that we have at all interviews when we're trying to recruit people. Everyone, sort of says, including my HR director, boss, next time for this position, let's get some men into the building. The demographics of the staff at NMCH is predominantly women. Generally, we do see that in the healthcare sector, but I think one of the more unique points for NMCH is that we're seeing women in leadership positions. Most of our clinical services are led by women. For example, our radiology department, the pharmacy department, anesthetics are headed up by women, both ICUs for that matter, pediatric and neonatal. And this really is based purely on merit. These people were appointed to be put in these positions of, such responsibility and trust to be able to deliver the outcomes that we have seen already. But of course, we've got the Professor Nzinjana, so we want to have a little bit more of that to be able to come into the building and share their expertise with us.
Born of Nelson Mandela's vision of improving access to quality healthcare for children in Southern Africa, the hospital is a specialized tertiary and quaternary medical institution and only the second in Southern Africa. This state-of-the-art referral facility has established important international partnerships, including Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore and Sick Kids International, to ensure alignment with best international practice. The Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital is a single entity that also sits on a technological platform to be accessed for telemedicine by other countries on the African continent and is dedicated to innovation and academic research to keep the hospital at the cutting edge of technological advancements.
At NMCH, we see the sickest children, meaning that we would need more specialized doctors. We're talking about a pediatric nephrologist, pediatric cardiologist, pediatric general surgeon. The nature of the conditions we see are so severe that the procedures are also quite expensive. It means that we need to have state-of-the-art equipment to actually give these good clinical outcomes that we're starting to see at NMCH. It's quite a resource-intense facility. Since seeing our very first patient in 2017 and starting with inpatient services from 2018, we've now comfortably been able to see more than 3,000 children and our first 500 dialysis treatments. And as part of the Madiba centenary celebrations, we celebrated our first 100 cases in general pediatric surgery.
Prince o qadile ho kula ka after 6 weeks. Yes, after 6 weeks ke qala a tshwa ke bo colic ntonyana tse jwalo re be re misa Sebokeng hospital ba re ngwana o na le brain damage ba metsa scan sa mo chesting le ka mo ka mogao then ra misa o physio OT. Neki upset, neki feel like my emotion was just mixing. ne ke sa kgone le control. Ne ke tshaba ya ka operation room. I was so scared. I just sent him to go and look. Then he just goes, just praying. Okay. Then we stay in the waiting room. The time he come out, I was so excited because Ujilemo abutse mahlo a hae a le wow fela nka ga tse operation room. Then the doctor didn't really happy kaofela. Experience ya ka le prince. So since ba mkentse shantena much better because wa ba le matsoa a sa buleya, mahlo a sa buleya, o sa ja hantle, a sa vomita, le weight o e gainile hape.
My hopes and dreams really for Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital is to see sustainability for this hospital. We want to continue in this model where government contributes part of their operational expenses, but also through donor funding and mechanisms of generating revenue, we can also contribute the rest of the operational expenses. So we would want people to partner with us that will ensure that in the future we maintain the level of the equipment in the building and also into the future to ensure that we can continue to provide the level of care and the level of service that we're providing for the children right now.
Growing up, I used to herd cattle and I used to go to school on alternate days. So one day I would be herding cattle and the next day I would be going to school. Until my mom and my aunt, who was a nurse, actually noticed that I was quite good at school despite going on alternate days. In grade 6, they decided to move me to a different village so that I could go to school every day. What used to scare me growing up in the villages were the expectation of men that if you're a young boy, you would herd cattle. But when you're grown enough, then your job is to go and work in the mines. Because they would disappear for decades, only coming back to their families once every year. Some of them would come back home very sickly of some lung disease of some sort that they have acquired in the mines. I used to ask myself, is this all that life is about? I am the head of pediatric cardiology here at the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital. And I'm also the vice president of the South African Heart Association. And I'm the current president of the Pediatric Cardiac Society of Southern Africa. I actually grew up in Esipaqeni, not very far from Puno, where Nelson Mandela comes from. And I'm the first one to go to university from my family. Among my inspiration when I was studying pediatric cardiology were the story of Chris Barnard, who performed the first heart surgery, which was actually done here in South Africa. Chris Barnard was assisted by Mr. Hamilton Naki, who was a technician. And the story of the first surgery for the blue babies in Boston, where Professor Helen Towsing, who was a lady who worked as a pediatric cardiologist there amongst a lot of men, insisted that they perform the surgery on that first blue baby. The surgery was performed by Professor Blalock, but Professor Blalock, interesting enough, was assisted by Mr. Vivian Thomas. And the story of Mr. Vivian Thomas is very similar to the story of Mr. Hamilton Naki, because they had both come from a very humble background. They had barely finished high school education when they worked as technicians. Those to me were the people who inspired me, coming from a rural village with a high school science lab with no equipment. I had to dream way bigger than the environment that I was in. Healthcare is a fundamental right. And what NMCH gives, which the other hospitals are lacking in, is extra access, because we're expanding the platform of access to healthcare. One of our biggest referral hospitals is Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, which is the biggest in Africa and the third biggest hospital in the world. Doesn't have cardiothoracic surgery services. They have to refer their patient elsewhere. And With the limitation of ICU beds in other places, this hospital has got 48 dedicated ICU beds, which is the biggest in South Africa. The output for most centers surrounding us is about 150 to 200 children per annum that can be done, which is why we're struggling with the waiting list. But in the 2 months we're operational with cardiothoracic surgery and invasive cardiology, we're able to do 43 cases. This speaks for itself that this center is really necessary and it can make a difference into the lives of the children. And it's heartbreaking for me. Some of our children even die while waiting in that waiting list for simple conditions, and something has to give. We need to make a change in the lives of these children. Who knows where the next Mandela is lying? So as long as I ask myself, why was I trusted with this responsibility? I'll keep going. And if not here at NMCH, then where? Should this change of the revolution to change the lives of children happen?
The Mandela Rhodes combination idea is obviously so hugely counterintuitive that nobody would have thought this is an obvious combination of the colonialist, imperialist of the 19th century, who was hugely influential, for better or worse, and the great liberator of the 20th century. Mr. Mandela is already doing great work through the Children's Fund, great work through the Nelson Mandela Foundation, dealing with some of Africa's biggest problems. We are much the youngest of the Mandela organizations. Mr. Mandela's mandate in terms of designing what the foundation would actually do became the way he saw the world. He just said, find us leaders. He said, I want a celebration of African excellence.
The core element of our offering is then the leadership development program. This is where we're able to bring together these young Africans that we've selected into a transformative learning experience, because this is where we're able to go through the different modules that cover the principles of the foundation. So the first module looks at leadership, the second one looks at reconciliation, and the third one looks at entrepreneurship. And then education is obviously the overarching theme as they go to school. Really, I think Nelson Mandela's vision about a Pan-African 21st century is partly what we're contributing towards, and his legacy.
From the very beginning, the inception of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation concept, the decision was taken to pursue sustainability rather than annual funding, and the intention was, which Mr. Mandela expressed very strongly, that if this was going to be an institution that had the kind of long-term impact of a Rhodes Trust that had been going for 100 years, this was the route to follow. And I think that we're one of the very few NGOs on the continent that has taken this approach, that has preserved its endowment. This kind of endowment funding is always the most difficult to raise, but it is highly rewarding in the long term, because what it means is that we are sustainable at our current levels in perpetuity and are able to make sensible decisions depending on economic conditions at the time about how many scholars we can afford that year. We've awarded close to 500 Mandela Rhodes scholarships to young Africans from across the continent that are absolutely life-changing.
There's something for me about the Pan-African vision that Mr. Mandela had that speaks to the generation that he comes from. A sense of renewal, a sense of unleashing the potential that exists on this continent, and a true realization that we're not going to move as quickly as a continent if we don't connect and work together.
I was 13 when the genocide in Rwanda started. I witnessed unspeakable horrors that took place during the genocide, and my family and I are very fortunate to have survived. As the genocide was ending, there was this mass exodus of the people of Kigali. There was only one way out of the city. My mother packed clothes, and I remember we had to take a mattress with us at her instructions. And I packed clothes and school reports, of all things, because we ended up in a mass shooting of people leaving the city, and somehow we survived.
P. Pacifique went to the University of Rwanda to study physics, but his mother urged him to leave as his brother had been killed 2 years after the genocide in a massacre.
After I left Rwanda, I didn't know where I would end up. I ended up south. And although South Africa was the only country I had said I would never go to because of language, I couldn't speak English, and also, of course, the racism from white people. So when I arrived in South Africa, I lived with the Rwandan community, and a few days later I was shown how to survive, and that was to become a car guard. And hopefully the drivers will give some spare change or tips when they come back, and that's how I survived. As an aspiring university student, it was quite humbling. I found other refugees, I mean nurses and engineers and teachers and former politicians and people with decent professions all had become car guards. And so after months, I eventually got my refugee status in South Africa granted. And the following day, I went to the University of Natal. At the time when I applied, I was not eligible for a study loan as a non-South African. And then eventually my study loan was granted, and I completed my degree in physics. I applied for the Mandela Rhodes scholarship, and I remember thinking, they're looking for me. I was very proud when I eventually was elected a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, which I started very well. So unfortunately, I had a major episode of depression, which was part of the PTSD as a result of violence. And unfortunately, I could not complete my studies. I had to announce to the foundation that I unfortunately crashed out of my postgraduate studies. And I remember having this conversation on the phone with Professor Joyce Ngongo, who was the scholarships manager at the time. And I was very anxious, I was very nervous, and I was very sad. So after a moment of brief silence, she said, P. Pacifique, I love you, and you are still a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, and always. I can easily say that it was my first experience of unconditional love.
P. Pacifique would later move to Johannesburg to work in banking. After a few years, he changed tack to work leading training programs for large-scale community development. He is currently the head of a business school in a professional development company whilst completing his MBA.
As the head of the business school, my objectives are to make it an Africa-wide project and see how we can take quality business management education to the continent, to the people who actually really need those skills. So one of my personal initiatives is to raise funds for tertiary education for refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa, to encourage people to take part in distance-related activities, running, cycling, swimming, so that we can raise money against those miles. It was endorsed by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. The most important thing to me now is the collection of lessons, like everything that I have lived through. It is so precious to discover the life lessons that are actually contained in those events.